right, you guys. I don't even know how to start this interview, man. I'm super privileged and honored to be talking to somebody who is revered and renowned in the space that I'm trying to be in, as far as MMA, combat sports, journalism, and just talking heads and just being a person that knows what they're talking about when we're talking about this stuff. So I got Mr. Pushback himself, Kevin Iole, on with me on the Making a Walk podcast. First of all, how are you doing? Welcome to the podcast.
Well, thanks, Antoine. I appreciate you having me. I'm doing great. Appreciate you being here. And I always love to see people trying to branch out, and I admire you for doing what you're doing.
Cool. I appreciate that. I appreciate it. So kind of digging right into it. Like obviously, like I alluded to, you've had an incredible career thus far, and you're still going, still doing new things and making waves in combat sports, and you're known for analysis and critiques of fighters and fights. And which kind of the first question that kind of popped into my head when you said that you would do this was, how do you draw the line between constructive criticism or constructive critique and outright criticism when it comes to fighters, promotions, promoters, fans, whomever? How do you draw that line?
I never make it personal, number one. So no matter what, whatever I say, whether it's good or it's bad, it's never personal. So when you do that, then usually if we're talking criticism, it's usually constructive criticism because, you're just talking about, hey, what is this person missing? I love both boxing and MMA, and, especially boxing. We see MMA still rising. Boxing is kind of on that, shaky. So I like to point out, like, especially when I talk boxing, some of the problems, because I feel like if we fix the problems, people are going to love the sport like I love it.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I critique somebody, when I write my opinion, I owe it to the audience to say what I saw, whether it's the broadcast is terrible or the broadcast was great, or the fighter was terrible, their fighter was great. And I think that the reason that they would come back to me, and the reason whatever following I have built over my years in this business, would be because people know they're going to get my honest opinion, and they're going to get my take, rightly or wrongly. They may disagree with me, but if they know that you're giving them your best honest opinion, they will respect that.
Yeah. Oh, that's a great answer. Which kind of leads me into the way that things are viewed today, because obviously we're in a changing landscape when it comes to just media in general. Recently on the basketball side, we saw ESPN letting go of Zach Lowe, a senior writer for basketball. And like we're seeing a lot of media outlets do weird things, at least from the outside looking in, it's
Yeah.
weird. So as these things evolve from the traditional outlets to YouTube creators, podcasts, non-traditional platforms, how do you feel about the way the landscape is changing? And like, how do you see people maintaining journalistic integrity when the landscape is changing so much?
Well, that's the big thing, right? I mean, I think there's a lot of people out there that are doing a lot of great work. And, if, like, I am not jealous of the space, I welcome new people and new voices into the space. I think that's what I love about the internet, right? It's democratizing. It gives everybody a voice. Now, not everybody deserves a voice. Let's be honest here. Some people, they don't know what they're talking about. And, maybe they'll say that about me, right? But, they don't know what they're talking about. They don't, ethics is a very big thing, right? They don't adhere to the same journalistic ethics that we adhere to, right? And that becomes a big problem. But, for the large part, I love it. I think that there's a lot of people that do, a lot of really good work. And I'll give an example. And this is just one of many examples. There is a guy that I had never seen him. I had never heard of him. Has a YouTube channel, MMA Joey is his name. And
Mm-hmm.
one day somebody sent me a message that he criticized me. And I looked at his video that he did criticizing me. And I thought, he's right. What he said was correct. And he was correct in terms of my production on YouTube and all those other things. I don't necessarily agree with that he was correct in terms of the issue that I was talking about. But I reached out to him and I said, "Hey, I appreciate your take on what you said. And I have become a fan of his, right? I think he does good work. I don't always agree with everything he puts out there, just like I don't think he agrees with me. But Joey does really good content and he's creative and he's thoughtful and the production is good. And when you get those kind of things, from people, you have to respect that, right? And
Mhm.
so I do respect it and I like it. And I think it's better for our sports, right? It's better
Mhm.
to have a diversity of opinion. When I grew up, there was no minority journalists pretty much, right? I grew up, I went to high school in the 70s, college in the 70s and 80s. There was no women, or very few women. There were a couple, but very few. There were no people of color doing it. And so the focus was very narrow and it
Yep.
was all seen through a white male's eyes. And that's not always good, especially when we're trying to, talk about some of the issues that come up, in these sports. And so I love it, the fact that people are creating. Now, the one thing I don't like is that, people make fake stuff up and you get some of that
Mhm.
stuff go out there. And then that creates a lot of trouble. They, put fake rumors on social media. They try to play that gotcha game. And to me, that's not the way to go.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. And it's interesting as far as, again, referring to the YouTube landscape and the way that people put things out there. As far as like MMA Joe, you were referring to, he has a pretty large following. I kind of watched him from his infancy grow to where he is. And what's interesting is the fact that the people who are viewing this, viewing different content creators, they kind of side with content creators instead of watching what they produce and having an opinion on it, but not tying that to the person. They tie those opinions to a person. So, for instance, like I am a fan of Dustin Poirier. If somebody doesn't like Dustin Poirier, they tend to like, okay, we're not going to watch his stuff, that
Right.
type of thing. And it's just a weird landscape where things were different back when, you get the newspaper thrown to your front door and you pick it up and you read the paper and, this person says what they says, they say what they said and that's just what it is, but you're still going to read it next time a
Well,
newspaper
yeah.
comes.
Think about like when I grew up, okay, now there was two newspapers in most cities, right?
Yeah.
But you would pick up the newspaper in the morning, and if you wanted to read about the football game or the fight or whatever it was, number one, they had to have covered it,
Mhm.
and there not a lot of papers, even when I was growing up, were covering boxing a lot more than are now. MMA didn't even exist in those days. But you only knew what happened through that person's eyes and that person's, you know, what their deadline was like, right? A lot of people don't recognize deadlines, right? Like we don't have them as much today because obviously, the internet is a 24/7, 365 thing. But back when there was printing presses and newspapers were going to press, you had that issue. And then you had, the television news, which, the sports segment would be what, 4 or 5 minutes. And so
Mhm.
they're trying to cover all sports and, there's not a lot of stuff. So now everything you could possibly want is at your fingertips. You could find, great reporters like Adam Schefter and, well, I was going to say Adrian Wojnarowski, my friend, he's no longer doing it, but
Yeah, St. Bonaventure
you can
now. Yeah.
find people like that are telling you what's going to happen. There's a lot of reporters that are telling you what did happen, and there's a lot of other reporters analyzing what just happened. And you can find that all over the place online, on YouTube, everywhere. And that's really good and it makes for a healthy environment. And I think, we appreciate different sports in different ways, right?
That's true. That's very, very true. So, which this kind of leads me to a different kind of a pivot of the question, but it's more about what's going on with you. A lot of people don't know this, but you were nominated or are nominated for the International Boxing Hall of Fame next year, which is a massive honor.
Yes.
I'm a big fan of Hall of Fames, and it's interesting when I've talked to some of my contemporaries in the space, and they I don't know. They have a weird take or thought about Hall of Fames when it comes to sports in general, but specifically about the UFC. But on this, as far as like you being nominated for what you've done in combat sports journalism, how does that being acknowledged in that way make you feel and reflect on your career and how you approach things going forward?
Well, it's not going to change how I do anything, Jax. I mean, I'm going to be the person that I am, and I'm going to do what I do the way I've done it. But it was an incredible honor, and it's something that I didn't expect, right? Like I know a lot of friends that went into the Hall of Fame, both journalists and PR people, and of course fighters. Um, but I never expected to be in the position where I would even be on the ballot, let alone, get in. And, I'm certainly not in the Hall of Fame yet. It would be an amazing honor if I were. It would be the honor of my lifetime. And I know this, if I ever get into the Hall of Fame, the first thing that's going to happen is I'm going to cry because I'm going to think of my father and how, I have never been into awards or anything. I've won a share, but I don't enter writing contests or any of that stuff because I don't believe that's what we're doing this for, right?
Hmm.
But a Hall of Fame is kind of a different thing, right? And my dad was always so, proud. And, it used to embarrass me when I was a kid because he would be bragging to all his friends or people we would see about what I did and everything. And so my dad's been gone, over 20 years now. And I just think, that day, if it ever comes, that it's going to make me think of him, which the nomination made me think of him because I thought, hey, Dad, guess what? Here we are. And this is really incredible. And I'll cry when it happens, because of him. It'll mean it would have meant so much to him. And because of that, it'll make me think of him. And that'll be a great thing.
Yeah, like it's interesting. Like I watch a lot of what in pro football, like I love football.
Yes.
When the Hall of Fame calls the individuals that make it and you see them cry, and it's
Yes.
like I don't know these people. Obviously I've watched their careers, but like I'm all tearing up. I'm like, because it's just you see somebody's life's work and the culmination of that work pay off in right in that moment. It's amazing to see, and I really hope that happens for you. That would be pretty dope.
I,
I mean,
I
I'll
appreciate
cry.
that.
I know that.
That's awesome. Yeah. I'll tell you this, like, what people don't know all the little things like I have back in the day when we had to send stories, I've had days where I had to pull off at a 7-Eleven and use a payphone and dictate stories over the phone to an editor because it was snowing so much and I couldn't drive through the snow. There was a whiteout and I'm having to cover a high school football game and I'm dictating it to an editor on the other end of the line.
Yeah.
And all sorts of problems that happen. The Floyd Mayweather Conor McGregor fight, right? I mean, maybe the biggest fight I ever covered. I don't know. I wouldn't say that, but from a pay-per-view standpoint, right?
Yeah.
And they kicked us out of MGM. And I'm sitting outside with people leaving, writing my story outside of T-Mobile Arena in Las Vegas, and it was, thank God it was a summer night, right? But I mean, just crazy, the stuff. And so those are the things that you think about, like all the obstacles you had to overcome to get there, right?
Hmm.
And sometimes it looks like you're never going to, make it to the top. You're never going to, accomplish or be recognized for your work. And then that Hall of Fame day comes and whoever you are, all those memories come flooding back to you.
Yep, for sure. And that's kind of just from the outside looking in. That's kind of the thought process that I think that people have in those moments. Which actually that brings up another thing. And obviously you've covered a lot of different events, a lot of different situations. But like, and it's probably not one, but what is a story or a scenario or an event that kind of sticks out in your mind, that is something that just you just remember that time? I mean, that's obviously one of them, but that kind of sticks out in your mind.
Well, I think there's two, and they're both boxing matches. Number one, and how can it not be the bite fight? When Mike Tyson bit Evander Holyfield. That was just such a crazy night. And Pete, and I don't want to get Floyd Mayweather mad at me, but people don't realize how big Mike Tyson was and is.
Hmm.
And if Mike Tyson had fought in the same era as Floyd Mayweather, he would be the biggest pay-per-view star of all time, right? Tyson was just incredibly big.
Hmm.
Um, and you're talking about heavyweights and all this stuff. And number one, I'm sitting next to Jim Murray, who was one of my idols, the columnist at the LA Times, to me, the greatest sports writer who ever lived. And I'm freaking sitting next to him. And I'm like, oh my God, I'm fanboying out. I'm trying not to, look like a goof during the fight. And then, when he got bitten, it was hard. We couldn't tell what happened at first. And, people at home are watching on TV and they have the benefit of replay and they have the announcers who are closer and who know, better what's going on than we do. Excuse me. Even though we were close, we don't have those extra angles. So you didn't know what was going on. And then, afterwards, like all hell breaks loose. And, I was going through the casino. There was reports of gunshots in the casino. And I saw people flipping over blackjack tables. And I was calling into the newspaper. I was working at the Las Vegas Review-Journal newspaper. And I was calling in information. And I'm standing there, and there's a bank of payphones, which, of course, you don't see payphones anywhere anymore.
Nope.
I'm standing on a payphone, and I'm on the payphone on the far right. And the guy on the payphone on the far left, I'm looking at him, and he's got a gun sticking out of his belt line. And so I said to the editor I'm talking to, I said, well, you know what? I'm going to call you right back. And it was like around 2 a.m. And we were just at our last deadline, right? The paper's going to be published at 2:15. A last edition, because there was multiple editions. And so I said, I'm going to call you back. She's like, no, don't hang up. And I hung up anyways, and I ran to a different bank of payphones, and she starts to yell at me. And I said, I'm talking about all this stuff going on in the casino, and there's a dude with a gun in his pants standing right next to me. So I said, I didn't want to get his attention. So that would be number one. And then the other thing, I guess, would be the Fan Man incident. I don't know if you remember the Fan Man with Riddick Bowe and Evander Holyfield, but I am sitting there, and from behind, all of a sudden I see the people, Bowe and Holyfield are fighting in the 7th round, and you see the people across the ring, and they're all acting weird, and you're going, what's going on? We don't know. It was outside at the Mirage, and you don't know what's happening. And all of a sudden, just as I turn around like this guy goes shooting over my head, and he goes and lands into, I think he crashed into the ropes, but he was right by Reverend Louis Farrakhan. Yeah. And so Farrakhan's security people thought it was an attack, and they're attacking this guy, and they're bashing him on the head. That was in the days when the cell phones were so big, and they're cracking him on the head with their cell phones and everything. And we have no idea what's going on, right? And it was just like, so those two things, I think, there were so many of them. Of course, I had the unfortunate distinction of being ringside for 7 fighters who passed. And that was, that's awful. And that's, one of the worst things about this job, that I've had to do that. But those 2 fights and those incidents, I think, when I tell people about my career, those are always going to be very early on.
Yeah, those are monumental. I remember those for sure. I was just a teenager when that was happening, but I definitely remember that. Going back to Hall of Fames, so we got the International Boxing Hall of Fame, we got Pro Football Hall of Fame, NBA Hall of Fame, and we've just talked about how important Hall of Fames are. And looking at the UFC Hall of Fame and the Hall of Fame process, I guess if you can call it a process, how do you think that compares to other sports? And do you feel that there's room and a need to reform that process on how inductees are chosen? And do you think that would be an improvement on the sport overall to kind of bring some validity?
Well, I do. I think there's, I think the problem is, it's controlled internally. So it's a UFC thing as opposed to being controlled by neutral people, like as in most Hall of Fames, right? Now, Ant Evans, who's no longer at the UFC, I think did a really good job trying to reform it a couple of years ago. And they made a lot of changes that improved it. But I think, until it's, not administered by, it's, to me, it's like the Pittsburgh Pirates Hall of Fame or the LA Dodgers Hall of Fame, right? You're being picked by the team. You take that with a grain of salt, right? But if you're in the Major League Baseball Hall of Fame and you're picked by the Hall of Fame, members who have covered baseball for a long time and who get to vote, that's a totally different story. And so, I think someday somebody will probably create an MMA Hall of Fame. The problem I think that people have with that is the UFC has been so dominant in the marketplace, right? Pride at one point in the, early days was ahead of the UFC, but then the UFC kind of passed it, and there's been nobody that's really been close ever since, And so the UFC is the big, and so there hasn't been this impetus to start an MMA Hall of Fame. And, I don't know if there ever will be, but, I think there's somebody at some point down the road is going to kind of try to start that and honor people who just weren't UFC figures, but were overall MMA figures.
Yeah. I definitely believe that there's a lot of people who didn't necessarily fight in the UFC, maybe, like a Fedor. Like Fedor deserves to be in some sort of Hall of Fame. People like that, that need to be recognized in that way. And even if it's just the UFC, like it feels like it's just Dana's Ring of Honor,
Right.
and Frank Shamrock should be honored. People like that should.
I agree with that. Yeah, no, I mean, I couldn't agree more with you. But, when that's the kind of thing, like, hey, I'm in the Nevada Boxing Hall of Fame, and they put His Excellency Turki Al-Sheikh in the Hall of Fame in this class this year. And while I have nothing against Turki Al-Sheikh, when they put him in the Hall of Fame, he had never even been in Nevada.
Yeah,
And he got in the Nevada Boxing Hall of Fame. And so when you have a Hall of Fame like that, hey, I was honored to be elected to the Nevada Boxing Hall of Fame. No doubt I was. But it's different given, how the criteria is judged.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, if you ask any, Dallas Cowboys Ring of Honor player, what would they rather have? Be in the Dallas Cowboys Ring of Honor or be in the Pro Football Hall of Fame? And there, and so I think that's what the UFC Hall of Fame is, kind of the Ring of Honor type thing. And I
Mm-hmm.
think people, if there was a regular Hall of Fame, that would be something people would be into.
Yeah, absolutely. So pivoting back to you, and I asked this question. It's kind of a sensitive question, but if you don't feel
Nothing
comfortable answering it,
sensitive.
whatever. Cool. Nothing sensitive. All right. So after 17 years with Yahoo Sports, you were let go in December of 2023, which to me, again, outside looking in, was a pivotal moment in your career. In September last month, Yahoo brought in Ariel Hawani, another
Mm-hmm.
prominent voice in combat sports. How did you feel when you saw that shift, and what were your thoughts on how the whole thing played out?
Yeah. I don't think the two were related, right? After I think I was laid off with about 50 people in December, maybe even more than that. There was a lot of us. We got laid off on a Zoom call or a Google Meet call.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the only thing that really bothered me, because I had 17 great years and a lot of my best friends in this world still work at Yahoo. And I have nothing bad to say about Yahoo. The only thing that I thought was bad was the way they handled it, right? We got all laid off, and I was there. I was one of the most senior writers in Yahoo Sports. I think there was only two people who had been there longer than I had. And, so I thought I deserved more than jumping on a call with 50 or 75 other people and being told you're being laid off. But I was happy. Like when Ariel started, I had there was no jealousy on my part. There was I was happy for him. Because, I know he was looking for something different. He had been in Vox Media, wasn't happy with the way that was going. And I'm not exactly sure the entire setup, but I think he's got this independence where, he's got a vertical and his stuff is appearing on Yahoo for a while, but I believe they only signed a 1-year deal. But I'm not privy to the ins and outs of the deal. But the bottom line is I hope he's successful. Ariel is good for the business, has been good for the business. And he brought on a lot of really good, people that are friends of mine. I think Chuck Mindenhall's a fabulous writer. Keith Idek has been a longtime friend of mine who's doing boxing for them. So I have no angst, no ill will toward any of them. And, I have friends all throughout the media, both in combat sports and outside of combat sports. And I'm happy for all of them when good things happen to them.
Yeah. Chuck Mindenhall, man. I love that dude. So good. I wish I could see more of him, honestly. But you mentioned Turk Al-Sheikh, who undeniably he's had a significant impact on
Yes.
combat sports, bringing high profile fights and events to Saudi Arabia, Riyadh season, all of those things. How would you compare his influence to that of like legendary promoters like a Dana White, like Don King in the UFC? Like, do you see similarities in the way that they were able to kind of shape the landscape, or
Yeah.
do you feel like it's completely different?
Well, it's a little different in that, he doesn't have deals with the fighters, right? Whereas, Don and Dana and Bob Arum and whoever else you want to bring into the discussion, they have contracts with the fighters that they were working with and are working with. So, excuse me, I'm sorry. But Turkey, has that checkbook, and he's a big boxing fan. And he's a combat sports fan. But I think people should not forget what they're trying to do. Like, yes, Turkey loves combat sports and especially boxing.
Mm-hmm.
But Turkey is trying to build tourism in Saudi Arabia, and he's trying to, make it a retirement destination for wealthy people. And that is especially for British people. And if you look at the sports that they are using in Saudi Arabia that are part of Riyadh season, auto racing, which is big with British people, golf, which is big with British people,
Mm-hmm.
soccer, and combat sports. And those are all big in the UK. And I think that, and there's nothing wrong with what they're doing. It's a smart business strategy, but it's not because they love boxing or they love MMA. The one thing I know about Dana White, and say good or bad what you want about Dana, Dana freaking loves both boxing and MMA. He freaking loves it to his absolute core. And, he does what he does because of how much he loves the sport. He's running a business, and he's trying to make his business as big and as profitable as he can. And so sometimes people disagree with decisions he makes. But Turkey's is running a business, but his business isn't combat sports. It's Riyadh, and it's Saudi Arabia. He's part of the government. So that is the big difference, right? Like, I respect Turkey. I'm happy that he's doing, I have written in the past about the human rights issues in Saudi Arabia. I kind of feel like you're just, spitting into the wind now when you talk about it, because there's so much stuff going on in Saudi Arabia that, it's like, what can you do? So I don't really talk about it anymore. I have done that, quite a few times in the past, but, I think that, you just have to understand what his and what their intentions are when you evaluate them.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. I definitely think that, since he's been involved, I mean, just from a fan perspective, like, we've been getting the fights that we wanted. And not only that, what I value in the UFC, like, I come from, when I started watching combat sports, the one person that got me into watching combat sports was Mike Tyson. Like, I saw what he was doing, and I was like, I gotta watch this, even if it's 20 seconds, I gotta watch it. And, it grew on from that. And what I feel like he has done that the UFC does is build actual fight card, not just one that's super top heavy where, yeah, there's legitimate fighters on the card, but they don't have the name value that some of these other fighters have. And he's been able to build actual fight cards, and I really, really love that about what he's doing.
100% agree. Yeah, I mean, I've written this a million times, right? But if boxing could be blown up and started over, it would be remade in the UFC image, right? Where you have everybody fighting under one banner, and then you go forward that way. The problem with boxing is, there's no barrier to entry to get into boxing, to either be a promoter or to be a manager, right? And sometimes it's, hey, this kid I lived next to a kid that happened to be a great boxer, and his dad asked me to manage him, and I became his manager. And this person has no, knowledge or, understanding of the sport and the history of the sport and what it is. And so now, he becomes a big player because his fighter is good. And then when his fighter is no longer good, he's out of the sport, and, somebody else comes along. And, and you just see that constantly. And a lot of times that prevents the fights from getting made. Now, it's kind of embarrassing, if I'm being honest with you, Jax, that just see the promoters fall all over themselves with Turkey, right? Because, they're kissing his butt because they want his money. Yeah. And, they would not have made most of these fights, but now they're getting paid big money, and they're making it, and the fights are happening. So it is good for us. The thing that I think is concerning, right, especially for the U.S., is these fights are all going off in the middle of the day, right? Joshua Ngannou was on a Friday, but it was Friday morning. the fight Saturday, Better Be of Bibble, that was, a Saturday morning, right?
Yeah.
Saturday morning, Saturday afternoon, depending on where you are in the U.S. And that's not a time that a lot of people here are watching the fights, right?
Right.
PFL has a pay-per-view this weekend, and I think, if I'm not mistaken, is starting the main card starting 1 p.m. Pacific. Um,
Yeah.
UFC only has one or two a year that they do that with, right? So otherwise,
Mhm.
their not Riyadh, their Abu Dhabi card in a couple of weeks is going to start early. But for the most part, UFC stays on the same consistent time frame, and they change the time in the other countries because they know the biggest market they have is the United States.
Yeah.
And I think, from a boxing standpoint, that's the one thing that concerns me, that we're going to have all the big fights leaving the United States and then all starting at weird times. And I think that has the potential to hurt the sport.
That's true. Because they would be going up against, depending on the time of the year, they would be going up against college football, and that's a tough sport to be trying to fight against when it comes to the U.S.
Of course. Well, look at Saturday's show was exactly that, right? I mean, there was
Yeah.
college football all over. You know, um, if you turned on ESPN Plus to watch Better Be a Bibble, when you turn on ESPN Plus and you look for it, how many college football games are on there, right? And
Yeah.
pretty soon college basketball is going to start up, and then you're
Yeah.
going to have the NBA going, and we're going to have the World Series going on, and so you're going to have
Hmm.
all these sports that you're competing against, and NFL's going now how many days a week, right? They
Yeah.
have games on all these different days. It's tough. I think I always would like to see the show start a little bit earlier Eastern time, but not as late as they do start, because you want people not to have to stay up till 2 in the morning to watch the great fights, right? But you don't
Yeah.
want them to also, they're at the beach on a summer afternoon and there's a fight going on at 11 o'clock in the morning. It's gonna that's why a lot of these shows don't do well from Saudi Arabia on the pay-per-view.
Yeah. No, that's a good point. That's a good point. Looking at it from kind of a bird's eye view, like MMA has like come a long way from being unregulated in a lot of states to really becoming kind of a staple of major sports. Since
Yes,
the pandemic happened, it really has blown up. And just being on ESPN, I believe that was probably a goal initially, and now it's like it's recognized as one of the, maybe not the core four, but I mean, in my mind, it's the core four, of sports in the U.S. So, given the growth that they've had over this period of time, what do you think are the next steps to further enhance like the legitimacy and recognition of the sport on a broader sense?
yeah, good question. I mean, I think one of the things we're starting to see happen, or it's really two things. Kids are training in MMA to start now, right? So back when Dana White took over, and for a long period of time, they were wrestlers or they were jujitsu players, and then they went into MMA when they were done with that. They're training in MMA now. That's raising the quality of the overall sport. But also what happened, the demo, right? So in 2000, they found the demographic was 18 to 34-year-old males. So now that's 25 years ago. So those people that were 18 to 34 are now, 43 to 59, and they are MMA fans, and their kids
Mhm.
are MMA fans.
Yeah.
And I think that's the next thing, right? Because now you grow up with it, right? Like whatever sport you followed or I followed, most of us got it from somebody close to us, our fan, usually our fathers, but
Hmm.
somebody close to us was a fan, and that's how it worked. And I think that that's something that's going to benefit them in the future, because we're going to see so many people learn the sport and become fans of the sport from their parents, and then they'll pass it along to their children.
Yeah. No, I totally agree with that, and that's happening in my household now.
Yes,
My kids are, they know even the the people who are fighting on the prelims. They're familiar with what
right.
they do, and so like as opposed to when I was young, like I knew, you know, every member of the Pittsburgh Pirates. Yeah, I'm in Dallas. Why would I know that? Like that's so yeah, no, you're absolutely right. It's starting to filter down to that second generation. So I can definitely see that. So you mentioned something earlier, and I kind of want to dig into this, you know, on as far as current events are concerned. So Beterbiev fought Bivol on Saturday for the undisputed light heavyweight championship, and I would say that it was a controversial decision to some. But like, what are your thoughts on the fight? And then from a more panoptic perspective, what do you see as the difference between a close fight and a robbery?
It's interesting. Like, I felt that was a close fight, not a robbery, right? I thought the appropriate score in that fight, I had Bivol winning 7-5. And I thought really the appropriate score was either 6-6 or 7-5 Bivol. But if you push, you can say, okay, there was some close rounds. 7-5 either way, or 6-6 would have been, kind of that. So as long as you're in that sort of, circle of scores, you're right. To go to 8-4 for Arthur and say Dimitri only won 4 rounds there, I think that is really pushing it. And I think that judge, I think he missed something. And power, excuse me, I'm sorry. Power is scored in the fights. And I wasn't there. And sometimes that's one thing that doesn't come across on TV, right? And you did hear Bivol talk about the power that Beterbiev threw. But I agree with you that, there's a difference between close fights and robberies. And I don't think that was a robbery. I disagree with the outcome at the end of the day. But I do think you can make the argument that Beterbiev won the fight. I don't agree with it, but I think you can make the argument. But you can't make the argument that he won 8-4, 9-3. Nobody that I know had it 9-3. But when you're asking, how do I define a robbery? Well, that would be a robbery, right? Because at that, you just, you're not giving the other guy any credit whatsoever.
Yeah, no, totally agree. And I had Bivol winning that fight as well. Speaking of another close fight, while we're talking about these close fights, how did you score Pennington versus Pena?
I had Pennington winning that fight. I gave her rounds 1, 4, and 5. And she won 4 and 5, but she did not win round 1, according to the judges. I kind of thought round 5 myself was fairly clear for her. And most of the media that I talked to, I don't want to talk for everybody in the media, but the people that I spoke to in the aftermath of the fight did have Raquel winning that 5th round. But yeah, that was, the first round they gave to Juliana, won the first 3 rounds of the fight. So basically Pennington needed a knockout going into round 4. She didn't know it.
Yeah, I definitely had Pennington winning that fight, but I could see where they were going with, round 1, there wasn't a ton of action. So I guess you can give it to Pena, but I don't know, man. I was kind of upset with that decision, but that's just my inner love for Raquel and her story and, her getting there.
Yeah, Raquel's a great person. I mean, so you feel bad. Like, the one good thing about MMA is there are so many good people, right? And I mean, so many good people. And you run into very few, jerks in the business. And, both of them are great, but Raquel is just a special person, right? And so you feel badly for her because she struggled her whole career. She was 500 for a lot of her career. And then she gets on this hot streak, wins the title. And in her first defense, it would have been nice for her, if you're looking at it from her standpoint, if she gets that win, because now she's going to get the big payday against Kayla Harrison. Instead, she loses it, and she got to start to climb back over again.
Yeah, no, it sucks. So another fight that you mentioned a moment ago, Max Holloway versus Ilia Topuria. So obviously Max is going to try to derail the hype train that is Ilia Topuria. What do you believe will be the key difference that ultimately determines who wins in the fight?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I mean, I have to think that Holloway's chin is going to stand up. He got dropped for the first time in his career against Gaethje in the last fight. And it was a flash knockdown, and he was up and he was okay. Topuria has that great power. But I lean toward Max, but I think it's going to be his chin. We know Topuria, is a power puncher and he's a good boxer. But I think this fight is going to be determined by the chins.
Yeah, I agree with that. I watched back a couple of Ilya's fights, and I can't find a hole. I mean, obviously Max knows what he's doing. I'm a big supporter of Max and what he's done, but that's a tough test. That's a really tough test. I lean Max because of his experience, but that's a really tough hill to climb.
Iole is quick, and he's got sharp boxing. And no matter how good your chin is, the punches that hurt you the most are the ones you don't see coming. And if he gets Max with something that Max doesn't see, can he stop him? I think he can. Is it likely he stops him? I don't think it is. But, he does have that possibility. So that's something that you always have to watch for in that fight.
That's true. That's true. All right. So to finish this up, I want to play a little game. It's called This or That. So I'm going to give you two options, and you can pick whichever one of those options that you want. No rules on why you pick the option. We'll talk about it afterwards, but you pick whatever you want to pick. Cool. All right. So the first question, Pittsburgh Pirates or Pittsburgh Steelers?
Oh, come on. Pittsburgh Steelers.
Why the Steelers?
I love baseball, but I'm a huge NFL fan. And when I grew up, most of my dad's life, the Steelers sucked, right? And I used to go with him to Pitt Stadium to watch the Steelers play. And they were awful. And then, 72, when I was 13 years old, they turned it around and they started winning. And, the Pirates were good for much of my early life, so it was no surprise, right? But the Steelers try to put a good team on the field, right? The Steelers care. The Pirates owner is a bozo, and he spends nothing. And the Steelers, hey, they haven't won a Super Bowl in a while, but they're all. I saw yesterday on Instagram, I think it was yesterday, or maybe the day before. The Steelers have gone the longest of any franchise in the NFL without a losing record.
Yeah.
2003. So over 20 years since they've last had a losing record. They always are trying to compete. And if you're at least trying to put a good team on the field, you're going to have my support.
That's a good way to look at it. And I will say, a lot of those times in the 70s, obviously I wasn't around for it, but they were beating my team, the Cowboys, which, we have our own show.
Yes, I loved it.
I hate it. All right, so next question. Muhammad Ali or Sugar Ray Robinson?
Okay, so it depends on what you're asking, but, you said I can decide on my own. Muhammad Ali is my favorite fighter, my favorite athlete, pretty much my favorite everything, right? I love Ali. I've got pictures of Ali all over the place in my house here. And behind my backdrop, I have Ali stuff. The greatest fighter of all time is Sugar Ray Robinson, no doubt. But if I can pick and put my criteria, my favorite, Muhammad Ali, no doubt.
I agree. I think that Sugar Ray Robinson is the best boxer of all time. But Muhammad Ali is one of the best people of all time.
Incredible person.
All right, so here's another one. And I've seen you dip into this with George, but YouTube live chat or writing a column during an event on Press Row.
Interesting. I guess doing my columns, I think that's what I do. Like, I'm trying to transition and do more video because I know less people read, and I'm trying to be as current as I can be. But I'm a writer, and that if I am blessed enough to go into the Boxing Hall of Fame, it's going to be because of a writer, not because of my YouTube channel. And so that, I would say that I like them both, and I love talking to the fans, right? I do love that. But having said that, if I had to pick, I would say writing a column on Deadline. That, that's just, there's nothing like that.
So much pressure for to write it, just I got to get it in between between here, and I want to say the things that I want to say. How do you get good at doing that? That's so difficult.
It's different now, Jax, than it was, for most of my career, even when I was at Yahoo. So when I was at Yahoo, right, there would be a UFC pay-per-view, and we would determine, okay, what stories am I going to write after the fight? And they wanted quick stories immediately after the title fights ended. So sometimes then they would win other fights, but let's just say there was 2 title fights at the end. Let's say it was like UFC 307. So Pennington, Pena, and then you've got Pereira and Roundtree. So I would have to write 400 to 500 words on the Pennington Pena and have that in before the next fight started.
Wow.
So I have 6 minutes, 7 minutes, and as I'm getting older, and I mentioned to you, I'm hard of hearing, And when you're in the arena, it's harder to understand the microphone from the floor than it is from the audience, right? And so, I'm trying to hear the quotes of the fighters, what they're saying, and sometimes you don't get it, and you still have to write 400 words and turn that in. Now that I'm on my own, I can do what I want to do, right?
Yeah.
And so, and so Saturday was a great example. So Better Be a Bibble's over. I really wanted to write a column, but as I got done watching the fight and I came upstairs to work, I said to myself, I am going to make my video recap first on YouTube and then try to use that. I'll put that in my story and drive people to keviniole.com so they will read my story as well. And so, like if I was at Yahoo, would have been completely the opposite, right? Or anywhere else, it would have been completely the opposite. I would have done the written piece first and the video later. So now I don't have the deadline pressure. But here's what I do notice. And like I messed up at UFC 304. I can look on my website to see how many people are looking at my website at any one given time. Mm-hmm. So Bilal Muhammad beats Leon Edwards in that fight. And I decided, I wasn't going to write a quick running story. I was going to wait and just post my column, after the fight. Mm-hmm. And while I was waiting for the press conference to start, I clicked on my thing and I saw there was a ton of people on my site. Now, nothing had been updated in a while, but those people were looking for my story, right? So they came to my site, they looked for my story. And then I waited for, Dana White to show, for Leon to show, and for Bilal to show. Then I wrote. Well, then by the time my story got posted, they had found the results and they did what they did. And I missed out on the fact that all that traffic I could have possibly had. So I learned from that, right? So, I do have the flexibility now to write when I want to write and post whatever I want to post when I want to post it. But you're aware of what people's habits are, right? And that's kind of the interesting thing.
Very, very interesting. I think for YouTube, for sure, when it comes to timing the things that you're going to put out, I do a lot of, not just interviews, I do a lot of video essays and about different topics. And if you don't put it out at the right time, it's been covered all the ways that you thought about covering it. And I feel like a lot of that is similar when it comes to writing too. If you're not coming with the right topic at the right time.
Now, for me, Saturday was a great example, right? So I sat here and I said, okay, I knew exactly what you were talking about. And it was earlier in the day. So the fight was over, 4 o'clock Pacific time where I am. Mm-hmm. So I felt like I had time that people would be able to see it. So I decided to do my video recap first because of what you just said, right? Mm-hmm. I knew people were going to be looking, hey, what's happening? And I have a little bit of name in that space, so people might search for me. And if they see my name and I'm talking about the fight, then they're going to click on me. And then I hope that they went back to, check my my story that I posted later. But yeah, there's a lot. It's not just sitting here and, as spewing off the top of your head and going. Yeah. And from a video standpoint, I'm just learning and I'm really trying to make my site. I promised people when I started, I said, hey, my YouTube channel doesn't look good. It is going to get better. And, when I started, I had my YouTube channel that had 4,000 subscribers and I'm up to 14,000 something now, mm-hmm. And I think that we're on a really good track because, the production is better and I understand what is needed a lot more. We're still going to get better and it's going to improve even more than what it is now. But I think now I'm kind of in a good groove and I think it's just going to, be I'm hoping to, have a pretty significant growth before the end of the year and then, make 2025 a really big year for my YouTube channel.
Yep. I'm positive that it will happen for sure. Last one, Demetrius Johnson or John Jones?
Well, I'd have to say John Jones for a number of reasons, when we're, depending on how we're talking, but I've had a great relationship with John from the time he came in the UFC. So let me say this story. His first fight in UFC was UFC 87. I was in Minnesota covering that fight. That was in Minneapolis, St. Paul. I'm not sure which one of the two it was in, but it was in Minneapolis, St. Paul. And that card, George St. Pierre fought on the card and Brock Lesnar fought on the card in the co-main event. And I was most blown away by this big 6'4", 21-year-old guy or 20-year-old guy, whatever he was at the time, these big long arms and big legs. And I'm going, oh shit, this guy is incredible, right? And I made a point to talk to him. I went up to him after the fight and said, hey, I introduced myself and I wanted to do an interview with him. And then John and I have had this like really interesting history together. So he used to call me, like I remember a story, and I talked to him about this not long ago. He called me and said, hey, what are you doing right now? I'm in Las Vegas. And I said, well, I'm just sitting at home. He goes, come to the mall and meet me at the food court. I want to be interviewed by you. So I go to this was like late 2008, after that fight, was before he fought on UFC 100. I go to the food court, I go to Orange Julius and get a smoothie and a hot dog, and I'm sitting there talking to John Jones, right? And he was just like, he was this good kid that was like in awe of his surroundings, and all of a sudden how many people thought he was great. Never had that kind of personal relationship with Demetrius. Demetrius, I always liked him. He was always respectful, but I didn't have that fun. And then John and I kind of had a time. He didn't talk to me for a couple of years, and it was funny. The reason he did not talk to me was somebody at USA Today wrote something about him he didn't like, and he thought it was me. And no matter what anybody would say, he thought it was somebody else. I mean, he thought it was me, not somebody else. And he didn't speak to me. And then finally, a woman named Karen Bell found the article, and she gave it to him and showed him. And then that we had this thought. And if you saw when John beat Cyril Gahn, when he came back past the media as he was going back to the locker room, he came up and he embraced me. And he said, we've been on a long journey together, and this is incredible, right? And I shook his hand. I shook his hand and patted him on the back and congratulated him. But I think John's the greatest fighter of all time. And I think his personality, he's had a lot of bad things that he did in his life, right? But I think he's an interesting person, and we've just had that relationship. And so I got to say him.
That's a good reason. That's a very, very good reason. Yeah, I have a certain reverence for John as well. Obviously, he's had his struggles, but as far as what he's done inside that cage, I feel like that's undeniable. And Demetrius has done great things as well.
Oh, of course.
And I definitely think that he should be recognized for what he's done. But John Jones is the best that's ever done it, and that's just what it is.
Yeah, there's no doubt about that. I mean, the only argument, and I kid with Dana all the time, I said, John's going to hate me because I'm saying he's not active right now, so he can't be number one currently, right? But when he fights, let's assume he wins. I think most people will, it's going to depend on how he looks.
Mm-hmm.
But if he beats Stipe in impressive fashion, I think most people are going to vote for John number one.
Interesting, because I actually have Alex Pereira number one.
I mean,
then my only reasoning is what you were just talking about, activity. When it comes, because it's really only out of three guys, in my opinion. And of those three guys, he's the one that's active. Islam has had his injuries. He's had the hand injury and hasn't been able to fight multiple times in a year recently. And of course, John Jones, he's been sidelined with his injury. Alex has injuries and he's fought through them. So I got to give it to him.
Look who he fought, right? I mean, all these champions that he's fought. I mean, it's a good argument, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if you have Alex number one, even after John defeats Stipe, but I look at it and I go, John's body of work, like once John fights, then, that changes things, because right now to me, he's been inactive and he's had one fight in 4.5 years. And he hasn't fought. By the time his fight comes, it'll be, I think, 19 months between fights for him, or 20 months. And that's, that is a long time, right? In this sport, when people are fighting like Alex Pereira, fighting 3 and 4 times a year. So, but now we can evaluate him, and we know what he's done. And then he beats Stipe. If he beats Stipe, that's no guarantee, right? But if he beats Stipe, then we can evaluate him and put him in his proper place at that point.
One last question, and I'll get you out of here on this one, and it's about John Jones. If John Jones beats Stipe, would you, let's say that you were his advisor, would you advise him to stick around to fight Tom Aspinall? Like, is the juice worth the squeeze in fighting the up-and-comer? And, I mean, I don't think it would damage his legacy overall. He is who he is. But, like, if he beats Tom Aspinall, then what? Like, what does that do?
Well, here's what I would say. Number one, this is a business. And if he beats Stipe and he fights Aspinall, that is going to be a massive, massive, massive fight. And because the sport is growing, I think it'll be bigger than the proposed Jones and Ngannou fight would have been at UFC 286 that they were talking about when Francis decided to sign with the PFL. So I don't know what his body feels like, right? He knows that. I don't know that. His manager would know that. So I don't have the information to give him right now. But based on just, hey, you don't want to look like you're ducking anybody, number one. And number two, you've been great for so long. And now cap it off with this massive, heavyweight championship fight that would, end all doubts of who was the greatest, right? I don't think there are any doubts, no matter what happens to John the rest of the way, but it would end all doubts, and it would pay him. I'm going to guess that fight would pay, they were supposedly offering Francis $12 million in that fight. I'm not sure what they offered John, but it had to be in that same vicinity. I got to think it's going to be more than that, right? And so that's going to be a big payday for him. I think it'd be hard to turn that down.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. I mean, I do think that it would be a big payday. I don't know. I guess maybe it's just like, you fight this dude, and what if you lose? Like, was it worth it? But I mean, that's a big payday. It might be worth it. It might actually be worth it.
Of course.
So, again, I definitely appreciate you jumping on and sticking around for so long, man. Is there anything that you want to say to the Making the Walk people before we get out of here?
Well, I just appreciate everybody. If you could check out my social media, I'm Kevin Iole on X. I'm Kevin Iole on Instagram, on YouTube, and on Facebook. And if you just go to my website, as you see back there, keviniole.com, I would really appreciate that.
Awesome. So, again, I appreciate it. And yeah, till next time, y'all.
Great stuff, Jax.